The Villery starship was a symbol of luxury and pride. Its golden walls shined under the lights, and the nobles who traveled on it carried themselves with the confidence of those who thought danger could never touch them. Servants hurried along the halls, carrying trays of food and drink. Music drifted from the dining chamber where high-born voices spoke about politics, wealth, and power. At the very bottom of this shining ship, far away from the noble guests, a human janitor named Daniel was busy at work. He carried his mop and a small toolkit, cleaning spilled drinks and fixing leaky pipes. Nobody looked at him twice. To them he was invisible, a worker meant to stay silent in the background. Daniel was used to it. He had taken the job because it paid enough to keep him fed, and because he liked the quiet routine. But on that day, the routine shattered. The warning sirens came without warning. The ship shook so hard that Daniel dropped his mop. The floor groaned as if the metal itself cried out. Lights turned red, and a voice from the speakers shouted about power loss and system failure. Daniel grabbed onto a wall, trying to steady himself as the ship pitched violently. The nobles above screamed in panic as crystal glasses shattered on the ground. The starship fell. It cut through the thin atmosphere of a nearby moon. Daniel felt the weight of the fall in his chest. Alarms rang, fires broke out, and pieces of the ceiling fell around him. He ran toward an emergency brace, pulling himself into the seat and strapping down. A roar louder than thunder filled his ears as the ship struck the moon's rocky surface. The impact slammed him forward and darkness rushed over his eyes. When Daniel opened them again, the ship was no longer a palace of light. Smoke filled the air, making every breath sharp and painful. Fires burned in broken chambers. Panels sparked, throwing light across twisted walls. He coughed and forced himself out of the brace. His body ached, but nothing seemed broken. Around him lay wreckage, and faint cries carried through the broken halls. He followed the sound. Nobles in torn robes rushed past him, pushing and stumbling as they headed toward the escape doors. Some shouted that the princess would be fine, that others would handle her, but none of them slowed down. They looked only at themselves. Daniel pushed through the smoke, ignoring the stampede. His instincts told him to search, not to flee. At the far end of a broken corridor, Daniel noticed a small chamber that had collapsed under heavy debris. Metal beams blocked the entrance, and faint coughing came from inside. He pulled closer and peered through the crack. His eyes widened. Inside the chamber, half buried under rubble, lay Princess Illyra of the Villery Empire. She was known across the empire for her grace and beauty, but now her face was pale, marked with ash. One of her legs was pinned under the collapsed ceiling. She struggled to breathe, her hands weakly trying to push the weight away. Daniel did not think about her crown or her title. He saw a person who would die if left there. He pressed his shoulder against the metal beam, his muscles burning as he tried to push it aside. The wreck groaned but did not move. He wiped sweat from his face, grabbed a broken pipe from the floor, and forced it under the beam. With a grunt, he pulled down, using every bit of strength. The beam shifted, just enough for him to squeeze into the chamber. Illyra's eyes met his. For a moment she looked confused, as if she could not believe the one who came for her was a human janitor. Daniel crouched beside her, checking the rubble over her leg. It was clear she could not move on her own. "You are not dying here," Daniel said firmly. His voice was steady, even though fear twisted inside him. The wreck groaned again as flames spread closer. Daniel knew he had only minutes before the whole chamber collapsed. He braced himself, set the pipe again, and pushed harder than before. The beam rose just enough to free her. Without wasting time, he slid his arms under her and lifted her against his chest. She was light, but his body screamed from the strain. He staggered toward the broken corridor, carrying her away from the fire. Behind them the chamber gave way, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Daniel did not look back. He kept moving, step by step, holding the princess tightly. For the first time in her life, Illyra realized her fate rested not in the hands of nobles or soldiers but in the arms of a human janitor who refused to abandon her. Smoke still poured from the ruined starship as Daniel carried Princess Illyra into the corridor. The floor was uneven, and fires burned in every direction. He could hear nobles screaming, but not from pain. Their voices rose in anger as they fought over the few remaining escape pods. They shoved each other aside, their silken robes torn and stained with ash. To them, survival was the only thought. Daniel coughed as the smoke stung his lungs. He glanced down at Illyra. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. "Leave me," she murmured. "Go to safety." Daniel shook his head. "Not happening. You are coming with me." She tried again, weakly protesting, but he ignored her. He pushed forward, stepping over wreckage. The nobles rushed past him without sparing a glance. Some of them even shouted for him to hurry and abandon what they called dead weight. Their eyes were full of fear, not courage. One noble, his jeweled necklace still hanging around his neck, grabbed Daniel's arm. "You are wasting your life. The ship will explode. Leave her. The Empire can crown another princess. Save yourself." Daniel pulled his arm free. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. "If you will not help her, then move aside." The noble stepped back, glaring at him as if a servant had insulted his honor. But he did not try again. He ran after the others, leaving the princess behind. Daniel pressed on, each step heavier as the ship groaned around him. Panels sparked above his head. The corridor narrowed with fallen beams and twisted wires. He had to duck low to avoid hitting his head. Every sound reminded him that the wreck could collapse at any second. Yet he kept walking, holding her close to his chest. At the end of the corridor, he found the exit door where escape pods had once been docked. The chamber was empty now. The last pod had launched minutes ago. Only scorch marks remained on the walls. The nobles had promised rescue ships would return for her, but Daniel saw the truth in their actions. They had thought only of themselves. He lowered Illyra carefully against the wall and checked her injuries. Her leg was swollen, her breathing still weak. He tore a strip of cloth from his uniform and wrapped it around her wound to slow the bleeding. His hands were rough, but gentle as he worked. She flinched once but said nothing, watching him with eyes that seemed to carry both pain and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at her, then at the empty chamber where the nobles had fled. "Because no one else will." For the first time in her life, Illyra saw someone act without thought of reward or status. She wanted to believe her nobles would have saved her, but deep inside she knew the truth. They had left her. Only this human janitor had stayed. The ship gave another loud crack, shaking under his feet. Dust fell from the ceiling. Daniel knew he had to get her out of the wreckage before the whole structure collapsed. He lifted her again, ignoring the pain in his arms. Her weight pressed against his chest, but he held firm. Step by step, he searched for a way to the outer hull. The path was long and broken. Fires blocked one side, and jagged metal cut off another. He had to choose carefully, turning back more than once when the way ahead was too dangerous. Every time he thought of stopping, he forced himself forward. Her faint breath against his shoulder reminded him of what was at stake. At last he found a section of wall split wide open from the impact. Beyond it lay the rocky surface of the moon. Cold wind rushed in, carrying with it thin air that made his lungs ache. But it was freedom from the burning wreck. Daniel climbed over the edge, carrying her out onto the uneven ground. He laid her down gently on a patch of flat stone. Around them the crash site burned like a dying star. Broken metal lay scattered across the plain. The nobles were gone, their escape pods nothing more than fading trails in the sky. The princess looked at Daniel, her voice faint but steady. "They all fled," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "Yes. But I did not." Her eyes lingered on him as if searching for an explanation, but none came. He was only a janitor, a man meant to clean floors and fix pipes. Yet he had done what no noble dared. As the smoke rose into the night sky, Princess Illyra realized her life now rested in his hands. And Daniel, standing over her with ash on his face and determination in his eyes, silently accepted that burden. The night on the moon was sharp and cold. The thin wind cut across the barren rocks, carrying fine dust that stung the eyes. Daniel stood over the princess, watching the fires of the wreck behind them flicker against the dark horizon. He knew the ship would not last until morning. Parts of it already groaned under their own weight, ready to collapse. Princess Illyra lay on the ground, her face pale. Her breaths came slow, her legs still swollen from the crush of the wreckage. Daniel crouched beside her, checking the cloth he had tied around the wound. It was holding for now, but without proper care it would not last long. She tried to sit up, wincing in pain. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Do not move too much," he said. Her eyes studied him in silence. He was a simple human janitor with rough hands and worn clothes, yet he carried himself with a strength she had never seen in her nobles. At last she asked the question that had been in her mind since he first lifted her from the wreck. "Why do you care if I live or die?" Daniel did not answer at once. He looked out at the empty sky where the nobles' escape pods had vanished. He thought of their hurried faces, their desperate shouts, and the way they had pushed each other aside. They had left her without a second thought. He returned his gaze to her. "Because I could not walk away," he said simply. She blinked at his answer. "You risked your life for someone you do not even know." Daniel gave a small shrug. "A person is a person. Title does not matter when life is slipping away." Her lips pressed together. She wanted to argue, to tell him that the empire worked by titles and duty, but something in his steady eyes silenced her. No noble had spoken to her like that before. No noble had looked at her as just a person instead of a princess. Daniel rose to his feet and began searching the wreckage nearby. He tore strips of cloth from broken banners, gathered small metal sheets, and piled them together. Slowly he built a shelter against the harsh wind. It was crude, but it blocked the dust. He carried Illyra inside, propping her gently against a slab of rock. "Better than lying out in the open," he said. She watched him work with quiet amazement. Every cut on his arms, every smear of ash on his face, spoke of effort she had never expected from a man of his station. Still, she could not stop herself from asking, "You know the nobles promised to send help. You do not trust them?" Daniel shook his head. "I saw their eyes. They were running from fear, not running toward rescue." If they come back it will be for themselves, not for us. Illyra felt a sting in her chest at his words. Deep inside, she knew he was right. She had grown among nobles who cared for their wealth, their comfort, and their power above all. She wanted to believe at least one of them would return for her, yet the silence of the empty sky gave her no comfort. Daniel returned to her side, handing her a small canister of oxygen he had pulled from the wreck. "Take slow breaths," he instructed. "We will need to ration this." She obeyed, each breath easing her pain a little. Her gaze remained fixed on him as he sat beside her, his shoulders sagging from exhaustion yet his eyes alert and focused. "You could have taken one of the escape pods," she whispered. "You could have saved yourself." Daniel gave a tired smile. "Perhaps. But I would not be able to live with myself knowing I left someone behind. Survival means nothing if you lose who you are." Her eyes softened at his words. No noble had ever spoken of honor in such a plain and human way. It was not about glory or reward. It was about choice. The moon's sky above them was silent, painted with faint stars. Daniel leaned back against the rock, keeping watch over the shadows. Illyra rested her head lightly against the metal wall of the shelter, still weak but strangely calm. For the first time since the crash, she felt a spark of safety. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought repeated in her mind. The nobles had fled, but this human janitor had stayed. And in his choice lay the difference between despair and hope. The morning on the moon came without warmth. The sun was far and pale, giving only a dim light across the jagged rocks. Daniel rose early, his body stiff from the hard ground. His arms ached from carrying Illyra, but he pushed the pain aside. The first task was survival. He searched through the wreckage, gathering what he could use. The starship was in ruins, its once bright halls now scattered in pieces across the plain. Among broken panels and twisted beams, Daniel found a half-burned crate with ration packs still sealed inside. He carried them back to the small shelter he had built from metal sheets. Inside, Princess Illyra stirred weakly, her eyes opening as he set the crate down. "You found food," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "Not much, but enough for now. We will have to make it last." He handed her one of the ration packs and kept another for himself. She noticed how he gave her the larger portion, even though his face showed clear signs of exhaustion. She did not argue. For the first time in her life, she felt guilty eating while another starved, yet Daniel seemed at peace with the choice. The wind outside grew stronger. Dust whirled across the rocks, and Daniel reinforced the shelter with heavier scraps of metal. He tied wires together, creating a frame to hold the walls against the storm. Each strike of wind made the structure rattle, but it held. Illyra watched him, her thoughts heavy. "You are not trained for this," she said. "You are only a janitor." Daniel glanced at her with a faint smile. "A janitor learns many things. When something breaks, we fix it. This place is no different." Her lips curved into the ghost of a smile. His words were simple, yet they carried truth. Nobles commanded armies and held wealth, but none of that mattered here. On this barren moon, survival depended on the hands of a human worker who refused to give up. As the day passed, Daniel tended to her injuries. He washed the wound with water he had gathered from melted ice found near the wreck and tightened the cloth around her leg. Each touch was careful, his rough hands steady despite his weariness. Illyra winced but said nothing. She felt his determination in every movement. In the quiet moments, she studied him. His face was lined with dirt and sweat, yet his eyes remained clear. She thought of the nobles who had promised loyalty to her family, the ones who had sworn they would give their lives for the crown. None of them had stayed. Only this man, who owed her nothing, had carried her from the flames. "Do you ever think of leaving me?" she asked suddenly. Daniel shook his head. "No. If I had wanted to leave, I would have done it when the ship first fell. You are here, so I stay." Her chest tightened at his words. She had been raised to believe loyalty came from oaths, yet this loyalty came from choice. It was stronger than any promise she had ever known. That night, the storm struck with full force. The wind screamed across the plain, shaking their shelter. Dust filled the air, and shards of rock clattered against the walls. Daniel held the frame steady, his muscles straining as he kept the shelter from ripping apart. Illyra reached out, fear flashing in her eyes. "Will it hold?" she asked. "Yes," he answered firmly. "As long as I am here, it will hold." The hours dragged on. Daniel refused to rest, his arms braced against the walls. When at last the storm began to fade, his body slumped with exhaustion. Still, he kept watch until the winds quieted fully. Only then did he sit down beside her, his breath heavy but steady. Illyra looked at him with new eyes. She had known knights with swords and shields, but none had shown this kind of strength. Daniel's strength came not from training or armor but from his will. He chose to fight against fear, against weakness, against the odds of the barren moon. As the sky cleared, the fires of the wreck burned low in the distance. Silence returned, broken only by the faint crackle of metal cooling. Inside the shelter, Princess Illyra realized the truth. Her survival no longer rested on titles or noble promises. It rested on the human janitor who refused to leave her side. Days passed on the barren moon. The wreck of the Velari starship still smoldered in the distance, sending thin trails of smoke into the pale sky. Daniel and Princess Illyra lived in the crude shelter he had built, taking each day as a battle to survive. He scavenged what he could from the ruins, gathering scraps of food and broken tools, while she lay resting, her injured leg bound in cloth. Every morning Illyra would wake to the sound of Daniel working. He cut metal sheets into smaller pieces, built small fires from fuel gel, and searched for water hidden in frozen cracks of stone. His body grew weaker with each passing day, yet his spirit never faltered. Illyra had been told her nobles would send a rescue fleet within hours of the crash. She had clung to that promise through the first night, expecting the hum of engines to appear in the sky. But now 3 days had passed, and the horizon remained empty. No ships. No signals. Only silence. As Daniel returned from scavenging with another half-burned ration pack, she finally gave voice to her doubt. "Why have they not come?" she asked softly. Daniel set the ration down beside her. "Because they will not. The nobles saved themselves. They will tell the Empire you were lost with the wreck. That story will keep them safe from blame." Her heart sank at his words, though she knew deep inside he was right. She thought of the jeweled lords who had bowed before her at banquets, the officers who had sworn loyalty to her family. Not one of them had returned. The image of their proud faces now seemed hollow, like masks hiding fear and selfishness. Daniel broke the ration in two and handed her the larger share. She frowned. "You need food more than I do. You work harder." He shook his head. "You are injured. You need strength." "I will manage." She stared at the food in her hands. In the palace, meals had always been endless, carried on golden trays by silent servants. Now one half-burned ration felt like treasure. She looked at him again, seeing the hunger in his face, and felt a heaviness in her chest. This man had nothing, yet gave everything. That evening, as the dim sun sank behind the jagged rocks, Illyra spoke again. Back on the ship, they called you only a janitor. They treated you as if you were invisible. Why do you still fight for me when they did not? Daniel sat across from her, sharpening a piece of metal into a crude blade. His voice was calm when he answered. Because I do not measure people by the way others see them. I measure them by whether their life is worth saving. And every life is worth saving. Her eyes lingered on him in silence. In her world, loyalty had always come from oaths or fear. Yet here, on this lonely moon, she saw a new kind of loyalty, one born from choice. The days grew colder, and their supplies ran thin. Daniel ventured farther into the wreckage, dragging back anything of use. Once he returned with a broken transmitter. He worked for hours trying to repair it, his rough hands steady as he connected wires and adjusted panels. Sparks flew, and smoke filled the air, but in the end the device gave only silence. He tossed it aside, frustration flashing across his face. Illyra reached out, her voice steady. You did your best. That is more than anyone else has done. Her words surprised him. She spoke not as a princess, but as someone who truly saw him. For a moment the weight of his burden lifted, and he managed a faint smile. On the fifth night, the winds rose again. The shelter rattled under the storm, but Daniel braced the frame, his arms steady. Illyra watched him with wide eyes. Despite hunger and exhaustion, he held firm, refusing to let the storm tear their fragile home apart. When the winds calmed, silence returned to the plain. The princess looked out at the horizon once more. No lights filled the sky, no ships broke through the clouds. She turned back to Daniel, her voice heavy with realization. They are not coming, she whispered. Daniel met her gaze. No. It is just us. In that moment, the truth settled deep within her heart. The nobles had fled, their promises empty. The empire had abandoned her. Yet she was not alone. A human janitor, forgotten by the highborn, had become her protector. And in his hands, her hope remained alive. The sixth night on the moon began with silence, but Daniel felt the air grow heavy. He had spent enough time among broken machines to know when trouble was coming. The sky above turned darker than before, and the winds began to rise. Small stones rolled across the plain, rattling against the wreckage. Daniel stepped outside the shelter, looking up at the growing storm. The clouds were thick and fast, swirling in violent circles. He knew this would not be a simple dust storm. It would test every bit of strength he had left. Inside the shelter, Princess Illyra tried to sit up, worry flashing in her eyes. What is happening? A storm, Daniel answered. Stronger than the last. Stay low and keep still. I will hold the shelter. The wind howled louder, shaking the metal walls. Daniel braced the frame, his arms pressed against the beams. Dust poured through cracks, and sharp fragments of stone battered the walls. Each strike rang like a drum beat. The shelter groaned as if it would tear apart. Illyra clutched the cloth covering her injured leg, her eyes locked on him. His body strained against the storm, but his face held calm determination. Every time the walls bent inward, he pushed them back with his weight, refusing to let the shelter collapse. Hours passed in this struggle. Daniel's arms burned, his breath came heavy, but he did not stop. Illyra watched in silence, her heart pounding. She had seen soldiers in polished armor, warriors with weapons forged in gold, but none had shown this kind of strength. It was not the strength of training or bloodline. It was the strength of will. Then came a new sound. A screeching cry carried through the storm. Illyra's eyes widened. What was that? Daniel frowned, tightening his grip on the frame. Not the wind. Out of the storm's dust, shadows moved. Strange shapes crawled across the rocks, drawn by the scent of fire and wreckage. The creatures were lean and long-limbed, with jagged hides that glistened under the weak light. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths opened with sharp cries that echoed against the stone. Daniel grabbed the sharpened piece of metal he had made earlier. "Stay behind me," he ordered firmly. The first creature lunged, striking against the wall of the shelter. Daniel met it head-on, driving the metal shard into its side. It screeched and fell back, thrashing against the dust. Two more shapes appeared, circling the shelter with slow, hunting steps. Illyra's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to call out, to beg him to retreat, but she saw the set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes. This was a man who would not back down. The second creature leapt forward. Daniel swung hard, striking its head with the jagged edge of metal. The blow knocked it aside, but the third rushed him from behind. Daniel stumbled, catching himself against the wall. He turned, blocking the strike with his arm, and shoved the creature back with raw force. His skin split against its hide, blood marking his arm, but he did not falter. Illyra's heart raced as she watched. She felt powerless, trapped by her injury, but she also felt something stronger than fear. She felt pride. The man before her was no knight, no noble, no chosen hero. Yet he stood against the storm and the creatures with nothing but a shard of metal and his will to protect. The fight dragged on as the wind screamed around them. Daniel's body shook with exhaustion, yet he never stepped aside. Each time a creature lunged, he met it with steel and strength. At last the shadows retreated, their cries fading into the storm. The ground was marked with their blood, and Daniel stood in the doorway, his chest heaving but his spirit unbroken. He turned back to Illyra, lowering the weapon. She stared at him with wide eyes, her voice soft but steady. "You fought for me. You could have run, but you did not." Daniel wiped dust from his face, his hand trembling from strain. "I told you. I will not leave you." Her gaze lingered on him, and in that moment something shifted inside her. She no longer saw a janitor who had once been invisible among nobles. She saw a protector, stronger than any knight she had known. The storm raged on outside, but inside the shelter, hope burned brighter than the fires of the wreck. The storm finally passed, leaving the plain in heavy silence. The wreck of the starship was broken beyond repair, half buried in the jagged rocks. Daniel sat near the entrance of the shelter, his weapon of sharp metal resting at his side. His arms ached and his body bore cuts from the fight, but his eyes remained steady. He had kept the princess safe, and that was enough for him. Princess Illyra stirred, her breathing easier than before. She looked at him for a long moment, studying the way he held himself despite his exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "You have stood against fire, storm, and beasts. Why do you still not rest?" Daniel gave a faint smile. "Because until you are safe, I cannot rest." Her chest tightened at his words. For the first time she understood what true loyalty was. It was not born from promises or wealth. It came from choice, from will, from a heart that refused to walk away. Days passed again. Daniel shared every piece of food and every drop of water with her. He stayed awake for long hours, repairing the shelter and keeping watch over the horizon. Illyra grew stronger, though her legs still bound her to the ground. Each day she saw more clearly the truth: the nobles had abandoned her, but this human janitor had carried her through despair. Then, on the seventh morning, Daniel noticed a change in the sky. A faint glimmer of light moved against the stars. He rose quickly, climbing onto a high ridge. His eyes narrowed as he watched the glimmer grow brighter. It was no storm, no falling rock. It was a fleet of ships. He hurried back to the shelter. "Rescue is coming," he told her. Illyra's heart leapt, though she felt a strange fear as well. Rescue meant safety, but it also meant facing the nobles who had abandoned her. She wondered what they would say when they saw her alive, carried not by their strength but by the hands of a man they once ignored. The fleet landed in a storm of engines. Soldiers in silver armor rushed forward, their banners shining under the pale sun. Nobles stepped down from their vessels, their faces painted with surprise and discomfort. They had expected to find ruins and silence, not the living form of their princess. Daniel carried Illyra out of the shelter, his arms trembling from weariness yet firm in their purpose. Dust swirled around them as he stepped before the nobles. Their eyes widened as they saw her alive, resting in the arms of a human janitor covered in cuts and ash. The nobles began to speak, offering excuses. "We thought she was gone. The wreck was too dangerous. We planned to return with more support." Their voices trailed off under her sharp gaze. Princess Illyra lifted her head, her voice clear despite her weakness. "You promised loyalty to the crown. Yet when the ship fell, you fled and left me to die. It was not your courage that saved me. It was not your honor. It was this man, a human janitor, who carried me from fire and storm when all of you turned your backs." Her words echoed across the plain. The soldiers bowed their heads, ashamed. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, their jeweled robes no longer shining with pride. None dared to answer her. Daniel stood silent, unsure what to say. He had not acted for glory or praise. He had acted because it was right. Yet now he found every eye upon him. Illyra looked at him with something more than gratitude. Her voice softened as she spoke again. "When nobles fled, you stayed. When hope was gone, you gave it back. From this day, your name will not be forgotten." Daniel lowered his gaze, uneasy with the weight of her words. But inside, a quiet strength grew. He had been invisible on the starship, a man who mopped floors and fixed pipes without notice. Now, because he refused to abandon her, he had become something more. The fleet carried them back toward the Empire, engines blazing through the sky. The nobles whispered in silence, their shame heavy. The princess leaned against Daniel, her heart calm for the first time since the crash. She knew the truth would spread across the stars. The Empire would remember that when nobles fled, a human janitor stood unbroken.